Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the first of my guest Q&As with the people that have an impact on your community. I'm really honoured that my first guest for these is our local MP, Hilary Benn. I'm going to quickly go through how this works in practice, and then what we'll do is we'll start going through the questions that have been sent in advance, and then some of the Facebook questions. So I'm going to hand over to Hilary in a second, just to have 5 or so minutes just to talk about where we are at the moment. We'll then spend about 20 minutes going through the questions that have been submitted in advance, and then I'll start taking some questions from the live feed comments and put them to Hilary for use. So with that, I'll hand over to Hilary for the first 5 minutes just to talk us about where we are and let us know anything key things we might want to know about. So over to you, Hilary.
Well, Paul, thank you very much indeed. And can I begin by thanking you and your ward colleagues for the work that you do day in, day out, week in, week out on behalf of the people that we both have the privilege to represent. And secondly, to thank all of you who have joined this Facebook Live event. The first thing I want to say is that as MPs, we have been very hard at work since the lockdown began. As I'm sure you can imagine, there's been a very large number of people who've been in contact with us. I was just looking at the figures earlier today for the number of new cases that we have taken on over the last nearly 3 months. And it's about 80% up on the same period last year. And not surprisingly, they are people who've got in touch, constituents and businesses that are worried about going bust, about the furloughing scheme, people who are self-employed, some complaints about workplaces where people have said social distancing is not being observed. We dealt with a number of constituents who've been stuck abroad. Now, gradually they've been able to come back, but that's taken a lot of work liaising with them and with the Foreign Office. Students getting in touch because they're not sure what's going to happen next term. What about the rent I've paid when actually I'm not in Leeds? And people having problems with universal credit claims and people losing money because they're making the switch from the old system to universal credit, and therefore written a lot of letters to ministers, and these issues have also been taken up in the House of Commons. And I mentioned one thing where progress has been made in the last 24 hours, as you may have seen yesterday, the position of care workers who have come from over the seas and are helping to support our friends, neighbours and relatives in care homes have been having to pay this NHS surcharge. And the point was put to the Prime Minister yesterday by Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, is it really fair that people who we're clapping every Thursday night, who are working in the NHS and social care system, should have to pay to be able to access the system? And I'm delighted that it was announced about just under an hour ago that the government is going to lift that charge from them. And it's an interesting example of how people raising an issue and asking the government and putting the government under the spotlight does result in change, and sometimes results in change which I'm sure we'll all welcome very, very quickly indeed. The other thing I want to say is about where we are in dealing with this terrible pandemic. Now, first of all, it has claimed a lot of lives across the world, the country, and here in Leeds. And above all, our thoughts are with those who have died and their families and their friends who mourn their loss enormously. This is, for a small number of people, a very, very dangerous virus. It's quite an insidious virus because when people get it, you don't actually know whether you're going to have no symptoms or it'll be relatively mild. About 15% of people who catch it roughly need some medical support, and about 5% get very, very seriously ill. And the lockdown has been essential to protect us, because if you've been watching the graphs, I've done a lot of finger graphs during the course of this, you saw the number of hospital cases and deaths rising each day, and it's now coming down the other side. And that's because the virus is spread by close contact with other people. And it is a great achievement of all of us collectively by doing what has been very difficult, not being able to see family members and friends. Although I understand, of course, that many people have continued to go to work throughout this. It's coming down, but we need to keep it that way. And there's a big debate at the moment going on about when and if schools should return. I've just written a letter to all the parents and staff who've been in touch with me, which I've put on Twitter and will be available on my website. And basically, I think that the return to education should be based on certain conditions being met and not on an arbitrary deadline or an arbitrary date of the 1st of June. That is actually what the Prime Minister said when he addressed the nation a couple of weeks ago. And I think until we see a further sustained reduction in the number of new infections and therefore deaths, and crucially that we have a test, track, trace and isolate system in place. Because if you're going to keep on top of the virus, and it was abandoned as a system back in March because the virus was very widely spreading in the country, when each new case is reported, when you get a positive test result, then the tracers need to get onto the person who's unwell and say, well, who have you been in contact with in the last 14 days? And then you need to contact them and say, you've been in touch with someone who's got the virus and you now need to self-isolate. And if you can do that at the scale that is required, then that helps you to continue to suppress the number of cases. Because if you don't do that, then we've seen from previous epidemics in history and signs of this in one or two other countries that have been easy to lock down, you can get a rise in the number of cases. And I didn't know a great deal about our numbers before this began, but that's the rate at which one person who's infected infects other people. If it's below 1, gradually the epidemic will decline. If it's above 1, then the epidemic is going to increase. And we need to get that in place, because the final thing I want to say is we are going to be living with this virus for quite a long time. Doctors and the scientists are working really hard to try and find medicines that will improve the treatment of people who are seriously ill. And secondly, they're working very hard to find a vaccine. There's no absolute guarantee a vaccine will be discovered, but that won't be for the want of trying. And therefore, until a vaccine arrives and can be manufactured in large enough numbers, we're going to have to live with the virus. And the question is, how do you do that in a way that keeps people as safe as possible? And some people will need to take more measures than others because of their age and medical condition, while at the same time ensuring that the economy is able to function after a fashion, because we need an economy working when eventually we are able to come out the other side of this epidemic. So that's just a brief introduction to what I've been doing and to how I see the current situation, which I think I would sum up as we're a bit betwixt and between at the moment, but we'll have to see how it unfolds. Paul, thank you very much.
And thank you very much for that, Hilary. I'm sure there's a few people have already said they agree with your position on the school bit in the comments, which is really clear. And I think all of us agree from Leeds City Council that that there needs to be flexibility. So what I'm going to do is go through some of the questions we've got in advance. Now, just to let people know, Hilary has seen a bit of an oversight of these. We'll go through these for about 20 minutes, and then we'll start going through some of the questions I can now see coming through on the live feed. So my first question is from Guy, and here it is. So given that for most people, rent and mortgages are a sizable chunk of their income, why are we as a Labour Party not campaigning for a rent or mortgage forgiveness instead of focusing on deferrals? This approach would save millions of people going into more debt that will take years, if not a decade, to repay. And locally, what can we do in spite of the national plan, things like council tax reductions? So over to you on that one, Hilary.
Okay, well, Guy, thank you very much for that question. Look, a lot of people are in real difficulty with their rent and indeed with their mortgage. I think the most important thing that we have said, since you asked about the Labour Party's policy, is that no one should be evicted because they can't pay their rent, their mortgage, because of coronavirus. And that is the single most important thing that will give a sense of reassurance to people. I think that the difficulty with a universal, a blanket rent abolition is, are you going to do that for everybody? Now, some people are still at work, still earning their normal wage and are able to pay their rent. Therefore, as a country, we're spending a lot of money on trying to help people in coronavirus. Would that be the best use of it? There's also a legal argument that some people would advance. If the government were to say nobody has to pay their rent at all, then landlords might say, well, if you're doing that, government will go after you to make sure that we get our rental income. So it is quite complicated. Now, the mortgage deferral gives you a breathing space. You end up with in effect, the same period that you're paying back the mortgage anyway. And that, from people I've spoken to who've got a deferral on their mortgage, they're quite happy with that. For rent, I understand, I get the point about the difficulty. Some landlords are being very reasonable. In the case of the university, for example, I've dealt with a number of cases where they said, well, if you're not going to be in your accommodation for the final part of the term, then we're not going to charge you the rent. So I think we need to deal with it on a case by case and sector by sector basis. And that protection against eviction, which the government has put in place for 3 months, but that's not good enough and it's not long enough. It needs to be there so that nobody worries about being evicted. That's the key point.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. And in terms of the council tax question, I think I'll pick that one up on my my Q&A tomorrow, because that's more of a Leeds City Council one, I think. So whoever asked that one, I'll answer that one tomorrow. Right, moving on to the next question, which is from Sarah. Why has the government excluded churches from its 50-page recovery strategy, and how and when do you think these will be allowed to reopen? We've had quite a few people have asked about this, because obviously we have quite a multi-faith community in this part of the city. So over to you again, Hilary.
Well, this is a very important issue, and I've had people contact me about this. Obviously, there are the overall restrictions that government has put on all of us in order to try and keep us safe. And the individual churches and faiths have given advice to their vicars, their priests, their imams about the closure of buildings and not having services, because you can't really do that on a socially distant basis. It is ultimately for the individual faiths within the regulations that the government has in place at any one time to decide how they are going to be reopened. And so to take the Church of England, for example, they have been discussing, as I understand it, it's been reported in the papers a week and a bit ago, a 3-stage plan once the lockdown measures are eased. And that requires the government to say that there can be less restrictions, because they had agreed that they would lift the closure of church buildings in time and in parallel. That was the phrase they used with the government's approach. And it was reported under the first phase, there would be very limited activities, streaming services, for example, from within the church, private prayer by clergy, as long as social distancing and hygiene measures are taken. The second would see the reintroduction of some rites and ceremonies, as not yet specified. And the final phase would intend to allow worship with limited congregations, as long as the government restrictions are eased sufficiently to allow this to happen. So everybody's working out with their tape measures to meet 2-meter distances. So I'm sure that the faith communities want to be able to tend to their congregations and their flock, but they recognise their responsibility to do that in a way that is completely consistent with the restrictions the government has in place and the way in which they are eased, again, to keep people safe, because whether we are going to work or shopping or praying, then it is important that we, since we are going to be living with the virus for some time, we need to do so in a way that keeps us as safe as possible.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Hilary. Now, the next question is coming from Innocent. A lot of my members who are supporters, but students of universities, are asking me about tuition fees paid for this, I'm assuming, academic season. these student members want their tuition fees returned to them, or alternatively at the least some percentage. What is the Education Secretary going to do about this development as a result of the university closures?
Well, Innocent, this is a very live and important question that you have asked. For this reason, there are two parts to students attending. One we've already touched on, which is the need to rent accommodation in the place you are attending university. And for many students and parents, because to get a lease on a property for a year, most lettings agents say we need a parental bond so that we're certain we get the rent paid. So parents contacted me the other day and said, I'm meant to be signing a lease for an entire year on the 20th of June, but I've no idea when my daughter will actually be returning to Leeds University physically. And then the second question is indeed fees. Now, we don't know the answer, I have to be honest with you. The question was asked of Grant Shapps, I think it was last week at one of the number 10 Downing Street press conferences. And he said, it's a very good question. He said, I've got a son who's in the same position. I know that the Education Secretary is going to make an announcement, but we haven't yet been told when that is going to be. So we've asked some questions about this to try and understand what the government's policy is going to be. Some universities have announced that all lectures next term in the autumn are going to be virtual. Now, insofar as there are seminars, smaller groups or tutorials, that's harder to do. Well, you can do it virtually. There's no argument about that. And secondly, is the point that you've raised, if students are not getting what they regard as the full teaching, why are they paying the full fee? I think the final point I would make is that the economics of universities, their ability to function, are also quite difficult because many universities depend a great deal on, well, of course, on fee income, including from overseas students. If they have no overseas students, they're going to see a very, very significant reduction in their income. And they're no different from other enterprises and businesses that are looking at the income they have depended upon and seeing a new future where for the time being that income may not be available, and how are they going to manage? So it's one of a large number of questions that are kind of queuing up for government to try and address. But I'm as anxious as you are, Innocent, to hear the answer to that. But it does require the Education Secretary to tell us what his plan is.
Okay, thank you very much. That's good. Now, we've had quite a few questions in relation to specific casework to do with individual people around school placement. So just for people, because this specific case, we're not going to comment on them specifically here, but Hilary and myself have already been in contact with Councillor Pryor, who's the executive member, and we'll be forwarding those specific questions on to them. But I think there's been some general questions around the school placement system, Hilary, so I don't know if you want to maybe make a comment on those, and then obviously we'll deal with the specific casework offline.
Yes, well, thank you for raising these. And of course, I met a large number of parents at the St George's Centre at one of my surgeries, must have been 3 months ago, when there was a protest after the high school allocations came out. And as you know, on that occasion, I was there, Jonathan Pryor, or Trustwell, one of the Middleton Park councillors, and the council in that intervening week worked very hard with Coburn High School to create an additional 60 places, which has made a significant contribution to trying to address the problem in the short term. What has happened since, however, is that more parents have come forward who hadn't applied by the deadline, and that has added to the numbers who need to be allocated. And that means that those 60 places have gone to people, and the new arrivals on the list, I understand, have been allocated places at schools that are a long way away. Now, I hope that the council will continue to work very hard to see whether there's any possibility of creating additional high school places above and beyond the 60 at Coburn in current circumstances. Obviously, the impact of coronavirus has made that more difficult in terms of ability to get things done, because everybody, and I must say at this point, I'd like to pay tribute to council workers of all sorts, people who've been collecting the bins, teachers and support staff who've been going into school, people working in social services, and also council officers. People say, you know, all they do is admin. I've been on a weekly call since coronavirus broke with the other MPs and the leaders of the city council. And I have to tell you, the effort and energy and commitment and compassion that they have put into helping people in difficulty has been remarkable to behold. And Leeds has a reputation around the country for really having got a grip of this, because without that contribution of the council and the volunteers, many people have been volunteering, delivering food parcels, getting in touch with those who are shielding, all of this community effort that's been going on, it would have made life very difficult. The second thing I want to say, and obviously if you've been allocated a school place and you're unhappy with it, then you have to appeal. If it's a council school, it goes to the admission appeal panel. The problem the panel always has, because they'd love to give a place to the school that every parent wants straight away. But if you have too many applications for a limited number of places, that's not possible. If they are church schools or academy schools, then the appeal panel is dealt with by either the diocese or the school itself. It's not the responsibility of the council, because we have a differentiated, some would say a divided system. The second thing, however, is that the council has been very well aware for quite some time of the crisis when it comes to high school places in South Leeds, and it's been working extremely hard to get a new school provided, including saying we will make available a site not far from the St George's Centre. The council has emptied the building, which was full of council staff before, and frankly, the difficulty has been with the Department for Education, because we would like that school to be up and running on a temporary basis as quickly as possible, and the government hasn't come forward with the money yet to make that possible. So one of the things I promised to do after the lobby at my surgery was to write to Gavin Williamson, which I did, but I'm afraid I have to tell you I have not yet had a response from him.
Wow.
In fairness, I'm a reasonable person, and in fairness to ministers, they have been working really, really hard on coronavirus, and that is on top of all of their other responsibilities. So one needs to give ministers just a little bit of leeway, but I'm going to follow it up, because this is a very, very important issue to many people in South Leeds, and in particular those of you who have asked this question this evening. If you want to follow up individual circumstances, then either contacting Paul or your other councillors, or Jonathan Pryor, I think, is always happy to communicate with people. And if you want to copy me in, then please feel very free to do so. I'm sorry about the length of that reply, but it's a very important issue. I wanted to give you the fullest update as to where we've got to.
No, I'm sure people appreciate that, Hilary. And just to those people that did send those specific questions, as I've said, me and Hilary have forwarded those on to Councillor Pryor as the executive member, who's already said he's willing to look at those individual circumstances. So moving on to the next question I was sent in advance. This was sent by Brenda. School related slightly, but I think it's probably around the safety aspects. Boris has suggested schools will reopen on the 1st of June. My daughter-in-law is a teacher, and this week has been phoning the parents of children in year 1 to let them know. Out of all the year one, she said, only 10 parents were willing to send their children back to school. She said she would only have 2 pupils in her class. Will it be compulsory that you send your children back, as most parents are too scared and think it's too soon to send their children back at this stage? Most parents want to wait till September.
Well, Brenda, thank you very much indeed for that question. And if I've summarised at the beginning what my view is on this very, very live issue, and you can see the full version of my letter that I've been sending to people. I'm not surprised that many parents feel that way, because let's be honest, for 2 months, the government has said, we need to take this virus very, very seriously, and you must stay at home. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. And that message has been very well understood and very highly observed by all of us. And therefore, it's quite difficult to make the transition from that to, right, it's okay to go out again. Now, of course, a lot of schools have been open, teaching the children of key workers and children who are vulnerable. I have a son who is a teacher who's been working throughout this on a part-time basis in school and providing online supported learning, as lots of teachers have been doing. So I'm very well aware of this. I don't think it should be compulsory, frankly, for practical reasons. Now, we know normally if we don't send our children to school, it's recorded as an unauthorized absence, and we have a responsibility, a legal responsibility to send our children to school. But frankly, in these circumstances, there's no point in looking at the issue in that way. In the end, parents have to have confidence, as do teachers and other staff in schools, that it is safe to return. And that is why we need to see a reduction in infections. One of the things that I'm pressing for is we need much more localized information about the number of infections, because you see a figure for Yorkshire and the East. Well, that's a very, very big area. And I'd like to know, what are the infections in Leeds as opposed to Bradford, or Wakefield, or Huddersfield, because then it will give us a sense of what the trend is, what the numbers are like. Secondly, I referred to the test, track, trace, and isolate system. The tests have to be widely available. They have to get quick results, because if someone is positive, you need to then, they need to isolate, and you need to get in touch with the people who have been in contact with them recently. We need the app. When the app becomes available, I shall sign up to it, because it's not a competition between local tracing and technology. All of these things could contribute. And when a test is done, and I was surprised to learn, I was on a call yesterday where a professor said GPs cannot order COVID tests at the moment. Now, I was completely unaware of this. I think that's really rather strange. We have to access it by other means. But if a test is done, all of the people who need to know, the person, other people they've been in contact with, their GP, the local tracers, the national tracing system, those who are compiling the statistics, need that information, because local information will help us to feel confident. And I also said in the letter that it may be that schools go back earlier in some places than others, because the outbreak, it has reduced significantly in some places and others. You look at the current figures, there are parts of the country where there's still a slight rise, but in many parts it is beginning to fall. You've got to protect staff in school and who may have relatives who are shielding, or you may have staff who need to shield themselves. And in those circumstances, you can't expect them to turn up in school and run the risk of catching coronavirus, and therefore they need to be able to work from home. So I think we're going to need a range of arrangements to give people confidence, to see how you can work to make social distancing operate practically in primary schools, although I don't underestimate that is extremely difficult, particularly with reception and year one children. And so I think the 1st of June deadline in a way has been quite unhelpful, because yes, I'm in favour of, you can have a target to aim for, but since the Prime Minister rightly said, whether this happens on the 1st of June depends on the conditions and whether they're met. And different people have different conditions. By the way, the science has to be published. And I'm very glad to see reported today that I think tomorrow the government's going to publish the science on what it is being advised on children's ability to pass it on. Mercifully, this is a disease with a very small number of exceptions that doesn't affect children as bad as it does older adults, which is unlike Spanish flu from 100 years ago, which was, of course, this is bad enough, and that was deeply shocking. So again, I apologize for the length of the answer, but that is my view. And so in essence, no, I don't think it should be compulsory, because you have to win people's confidence rather than say you must send your child to school. And each parent will make a decision based on what they think is best for their child and for them. And that's what I do as a parent, and I'm sure everyone else will as well.
Thank you very much for that, Hilary. So we're now going to go on to the live questions, the ones you haven't seen so in advance. So the first question is from Simon. Evening, Paul and Mr. Benn. Please, could you tell me how long the furlough process has been given, and will it last until we all go back to work?
Well, thank you, Simon, for the question. The Chancellor last week announced that he was going to extend the furlough scheme to October, but also said from August onwards, he wants employers to make a contribution. Now, I welcome that, because the big worry is what happens when furlough eventually ends. And the government, quite rightly, and we encourage them to do this, and I must say my approach, and I'm a Labour MP, the Labour Party's approach in all of this has been, yes, to scrutinise and hold the government to account, not because we want to score points, but because we want to applaud the government when they get things right, and where things aren't quite right, as we've seen with care homes and testing and so on and so forth, to point this out in order to encourage the government to get it right. That is our job as a responsible opposition, and we want the government to get it right. The worry was that if you didn't have a furlough scheme, then a lot of businesses would say, I'm terribly sorry, I can't keep you on because I've got no income coming in. Whether it's a pub or a restaurant, or I was on a call the beginning of this week with the theatres and the opera and the ballet in Leeds. Now, they have furloughed a very large number of staff because they have no audiences, they're putting on no performances, they're getting no income, apart from the grant income that contributes to part of what they rely on. I think the worry, let's be honest, is what will happen to those businesses at that point. Now, lots of people have been going to work, and I think this is important to remember. Although the government is paying the wages of now 7.5 million people through the furlough and the self-employed scheme, lots of people have been going to work because there has been confusion around this. When the government shut down a whole load of things, it gave a list, and they were the places where we would congregate and run the greatest risk of spreading the disease. Then they came up with a list of key workers for one reason only, because they had to define whose children could still go to school. But some people looked at the key workers list and said, well, if you're not a key worker, you shouldn't be going to work at all. And that is not what the government said at the time, and lots of people have been going to work in the meantime. But if, let's say, you are a restaurant and the furlough scheme comes to an end in October, can you run a restaurant on a socially distant basis? And I've heard people who run restaurants on the radio saying, look, we could have 40% of our table space and open. He said, I can't run a restaurant on a 40% occupancy because we rely on a busy day on 70% of the tables being full on the normal basis. So the question will be, what are you going to do in those circumstances? So I think for each business, it will be different, but we need to keep the furlough scheme going. But we also have to be honest that there is already a rise in unemployment. You look at the increase in the number of universal credit applications, and we're heading for a very, very difficult economic position because we've been advised we're looking at the worst recession for 300 years, and by definition, none of us have experienced that at all. And we've got to support one another. That for me is the most important thing. And some things will return and some things are not going to return, and there will be a new normal, and we have to make sure that it is a new normal which gives people the opportunity to earn a living and look after their families, and that is a huge challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Harry. So the next question on the feed, because the one before that was more of a comment, so we'll go to the questions first. From Guy, what are the options for employees whose employer wants them to go back to work but don't think it's safe to do so? And can you include what will happen to teachers as part of that?
Well, the government has produced a very large amount of guidance about what I think the phrase is a COVID secure workplace is. Again, we have to be honest with each other. If I were to ask you, Paul, if I go and do this, can you absolutely guarantee under no circumstances will I catch the coronavirus? You can't give me that guarantee. I can't give you that guarantee, nor can anybody else. It might happen at work, it might happen when we're going shopping, it may happen when we're walking past somebody on the street, maybe a family member who comes home who has contracted it. So the question is, how can you make things as safe as possible? And there's a lot of detailed guidance. And many of the cases that I dealt with early on were precisely phone calls and emails from people who were in that situation. I think it was Guy who asked the question, who were going to work and they didn't feel that their employer was taking social distancing, hand washing, the availability of sanitizer, cleaning workspaces seriously enough. And lots of other MPs dealt with the same kind of cases, put pressure on the employers, things then improved. So there is if you like, a manual, which is the government guidance, which employers need to fulfill. And if they're not doing that, if you're a member of a trade union, take it up with your trade union rep. You can raise issues with me. You can raise issues with the health and safety executive, although there are questions about the way in which they're working at the moment. And the same is true of schools. But there are also workplaces where, because of the nature of the work, maintaining 2 meter separation is really quite difficult, and not to say impossible. If you're a primary school teacher, you're going to be closer than 2 meters on occasions to children. If you're working in a hospital, you're going to be obviously working very closely alongside your colleagues and your patients, which raises the question of masks. And that's the one other thing I wanted to say, because the first question I asked of Matt Hancock in the House of Commons shortly after this all broke out was about the wearing of masks. Now, the advice at that time was, well, it doesn't really make any difference. Now, I've always been very, very skeptical about that. I think it does. And now the advice is beginning to change. The advice is a mask or a face covering reduces the risk that we might give it to other people, because it's the equivalent of sneezing into your arm or putting a tissue in front of your face if you cough or sneeze. And the advice about wearing masks in crowded places like in shops or when going on public transport is a whole other question. So I expect we will see more people wearing masks. People may choose to wear masks when they're at work. I think that should be a matter of personal choice. And I've also said that if there are times, for example, at school where teachers say, I prefer to wear a mask at this moment, then I think people should be perfectly free to do that. Because in the end, we have a responsibility to protect ourselves and those we love, alongside our duty to protect others.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Hilary. So the next question is from Wray. COVID-19 has impacted massively on local sports clubs financially due to the amount of subscriptions lost. Would you speak to the council about offering pitches for free or for a discount rate for the coming season to help relieve the pressure? As it stands, the council are increasing the prices for the coming season.
Right, Wayne, thanks very much for your question. Well, the first problem, of course, with sport is when can it get up and running again? Now, there has been some easing, golf and tennis, things like that, which we can now do with one other person as long as we maintain socially distant. There's a very live debate going on in football, for example, about whether the Premier League can come back. Players are in training at the moment. We've seen what's happened in the German Bundesliga, playing in front of empty stadiums last weekend. I think there are two parts to your question. One is, under what circumstances can sport return? And then secondly, you're making a point about the income of sport and the voluntary sector, but that applies equally to loads of other areas of the voluntary sector. And about a month and a bit ago, I was one of a number of MPs who wrote to the government and said, look, a lot of voluntary organisations are in real financial difficulty because they've lost their income. Is there something you can do? And the government did come forward and announce a sum of money, which is in the process of being allocated. I think your question raises a very important point about how we're going to support each other to get back up and running. I would, however, add one other thing. Voluntary organisations and employers are not the only people who have lost income. The same is true of the council. because the council has had very significant expenditure on doing things, but crucially, even more important than that, it's had a huge loss of income because people not paying, able to pay their rent, or not paying their council tax, or not getting income from parking, not getting income from charges for sports pitches and other things like this. And although the government has made some money available to Leeds, it by no means makes up the whole gap. And therefore councils face a big problem because they have statutory services to run. And we also need to think about how they're going to be able to do that going forward. So I'm absolutely sympathetic to the plight of the voluntary sector. We're going to have to see how we can find a way through this.
Thank you very much for that, Hilary. So the next question comes from Paul. Will more school buses be laid on? I think this is in reference probably to the guidance that's come through about the amount of social distancing needed on buses.
Well, that's a very good question. If there is as there will have to be, a limit on the number of pupils who can get into a school bus in order to maintain the social distance, and that isn't enough to take the pupils who need to be taken, then I would presume that more buses will be laid on. But that's just an observation by me. I don't know the answer to the question as to what is being planned. I don't know whether you do, Paul, or it's something that you could.
No,
if you could take that up and ask,
yeah,
and then perhaps go back to Paul. I think it was who asked the question.
Yeah, no, I think I'll add that to my list of questions.
Okay.
So next one is from Ian. Can Hilary ask Parliament why the French Navy are escorting migrant boats to British waters? Hopefully, obviously, none of the poor people have any of the infection. So I think this is also in relation to some of the escorting of people that are in the Channel back to British waters.
Honest answer is I don't know why the French Navy is doing that, and whatever responsibilities we have as parliamentarians, the tasking of the French Navy is not one of them. I suppose when people are found in boats in the Channel, the question is, do they go back to France or do they come to UK? That's the first point. The second point, and clearly if people have been in France where they can claim asylum, and France is indeed a safe country, as the United Kingdom is, then I think it is important that people claim asylum in the first country which they arrive. That is the basis of the agreement that has been reached between EU member states under what's known as the Dublin Convention. And if someone then comes to Britain and the first thing the Home Office does is to say, does anyone recognise the fingerprints of this person? And if they do recognise them and they have claimed asylum in France or Italy, then they will say, well, you need to go back there because that's where your asylum claim will be processed. The second part of your question is about checking travellers. Now, this was raised right at the beginning, and the government said, we don't really think it makes a lot of difference, bluntly, because the virus is already here and spreading widely. And I don't know whether through what I think is known as forensic genetics, in due course, scientists will be able to track the precise journey of the virus from place to place. To take one example, clearly people who were skiing in the Alps were responsible for some of the cases that came here. It's not the fault of the people who were enjoying a rest. It's just the way the virus spreads because it was very infectious. But the number of people who've been coming to the country now, of course, has been dramatically reduced, apart from Brits returning home, because there's nowhere to stay. There are no hotels, there are no guest houses, no breakfast, no B&B. And I welcome the fact that the government announced a couple of weeks ago that it is intending to put in place a quarantine restriction so that if people are coming, they will have to quarantine for 14 days. Because as we get the numbers down, it makes absolutely no sense to allow the numbers to increase again because people come into the country who may be infectious, who then spread it again. So I strongly support the quarantine proposal the government said it's going to come forward with, although of course that has huge implications for the tourism industry. And that's another sector of the economy where many, many people work. Summer is a very, very busy season. Who will be saying, and the employers within that sector who will be saying, well, I'm sorry if there are no tourists, if the circumstances of coronavirus mean that people can't come to the country. We I think have 90 million visitors a year. It's a really important contribution to the economy, then that's going to affect tourism too. But I am in favour of checking people as they arrive, one, and two, ensuring that they are quarantined. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So the next question is from Tom. Given that the city has correctly been making it much more necessary to travel by public transport to get into the city, since the government wants workers back in work, how are they meant to get to work given our buses and trains are normally already heavily oversubscribed during peak hours?
This is another very, very good question, because the things that the government says it wants to do don't really square, because about half the households in my constituency don't have a car. So saying driving if you can, well, works for some people, but not for others. And if you're going to have a socially distanced bus or a train, then the capacity is going to be very significantly reduced compared to what we're normally used to. And there isn't an easy way unless people can walk and cycle. But of course, lots of people can't do that because of the nature of their work or the distance that is involved. What can be done to try and stagger working time? That's quite difficult to square with the availability of buses, because it requires a lot of employers to agree on a staggering arrangement between them, and then to say, well, you should get on a bus at this time and you shouldn't get on a bus till later on. And I find it quite hard to see how that is going to work. And of course, there are many workplaces where the work time is in effect fixed. Shops, for example, if shops reopen on a socially distanced basis. The one thing that is happening is that for those who can work from home, it's really, really important that people continue to work from home, because the national figures are really striking. The huge increase there's been in the number of people who are working from home. And I would always encourage employers to make that possible if they haven't done it thus far. And I think in the medium to long term, it will raise some quite interesting questions, because there will be employers, as they look at productivity of home working, and we'll have to see how that works out, may say, do we need quite so many expensive office buildings in city centres with lots of desks, if actually we can move to a model where there's more home working as part of the week? So that's going to be interesting to see whether that is one of the longer term changes as a result of coronavirus. But someone wrote to me yesterday and said, if I can't get on the bus and 4 buses go by and I arrive at work and I'm late and my employer says, what am I meant to do? Mm-hmm. And I think he's got a really, really, really good point. And I don't know what the answer is. The buses and the trains, however, do need to put more services on, as many as they possibly can, to try and increase the capacity on a social distance basis. But I don't have a ready answer to that conundrum that you rightly highlighted. And if anybody does, anyone who's watching, then please get in touch. I'll very happily pass it on.
Good politicians always take suggestions. So a question, do you not agree that non-essential services like schools should not be reopening in that case? I think this is referring to safety again. If they cannot maintain social distancing, is this without personal protective equipment and other issues?
Well, I think I've already answered on what my view is about when schools should reopen. Of course, we want our children to go to school. It's very important for their future lives. But it has to be on the basis that I set out earlier. And I've also, I think, answered the question about personal protective equipment. If people out in any workplace want to wear personal protective equipment, then my personal view is they should be absolutely free to do so. And now, of course, one of the consequences of this outbreak is we need to increase capacity to make PPE, because we've seen the consequence of a lack of PPE, in some cases in the NHS and in care homes, which has been a very, very serious matter. I've been on calls where the council's been contacting care homes on basically a daily basis, trying to provide further stocks when people were running really low from the local resilience forum stocks that are available. But the truth is, everyone has been chasing around the world the PPE equipment that is available because everyone needs more. And of course, if you use it properly, a lot of it needs to be disposed of for the next patient. And that means you're talking about a very, very large number of gowns and visors and so on and so forth, unless you can sterilize them satisfactorily.
So the next question is from Brenda. I'm medically vulnerable and have been shielding for 10 weeks. My doctor and the government said this was for 12 weeks. Will this be extended or dropped?
We're going to have to wait and see what the government says. But my expectation, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but I would say if you have been shielding, it would not surprise me if the government says you should go on doing so. Because as long as the virus is still in circulation, albeit at a reduced rate, then I mean, I welcome the fact that the government identified that I think it's 1.4 million people who, because of their medical conditions, are particularly vulnerable, and contacted them all and put in place the food delivery system. But we'll have to wait and see what the government says on the basis of the scientific and the medical advice, and then we should follow it. Which gives me the chance to say one other thing about the science. I know the phrase has been heard a lot, we are being guided by the science. The truth is, there isn't one science or one scientific view, because I'm sure, like me, you've been watching the telly and looking at the newspapers, and the discussions have been taking place. And scientists do disagree. They have different views about what is going on, what the right thing to do is. And for those who are actually taking the decision, the elected representatives, and I've dealt with animal disease outbreaks during my time as a cabinet minister, and you get scientific advice, in my case from the chief veterinary officer, but then you have to take a decision about whether you're going to do this or whether you're going to do that. And that's why I'm very much in favor of sharing scientific opinion with the public, because it enables us to understand what the advice has been. And scientists will often say to you when you ask a question, I've been doing some fairly regular Zoom calls with scientists on them. And scientists will often say, this is what we know from a lot of research evidence. This is what we think is happening, but the range of uncertainty is the real infection rate, for example, could be at this level, and it could be at that level. Until we have more data, we are not going to be able to say definitely what is the case. And so it's not as absolute as sometimes the phrase "we are following the science" would suggest.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Hilary. So going to the last couple of questions now.
Okay.
This is from another Paul. What will happen if your travel agent says your holiday is going to go ahead in July, but as you said, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks? When you get back, would the customer be able to get a refund of their money, or would you lose that money?
Well, that is a very good question. I have not thought about that. Now, I suspect the first issue would be, if you have travel insurance, what does it say about that? I think the prior question is, where is anyone going to be able to go for a foreign holiday this summer? Now, there's been a bit of reporting in the news in the last couple of days suggesting that Greece, for example, might say to a country with a very low rate of infections, we're happy to have an air bridge. So if your citizens get on a plane, fly to Greece, have their holiday and fly back, then we'll allow them to come in. but we wouldn't want people from countries where coronavirus is endemic or widespread to do that. Now, I'm not sure how that's going to work in practice. So will people be able to go? And I think that is not really clear at the moment. Secondly, people will have to decide whether they want to do that, because they'll have to look at what is the extent of the number of cases in the place that they're going, what are the social distancing measures that the hotel is going to put in place, what happens if you fall ill, who is responsible for getting you back, what are the medical facilities like wherever you are planning to go. And then finally, the question would be, well, what is the policy of the travel company in those circumstances? If you would like to send me an email, if you send it to benh@parliament.uk, BENNH@parliament, PARLIAMENT.uk, then I would gladly put that to the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, who's got responsibility for tourism, and also the Secretary of State for Transport, who deals with the airlines.
Okay. I'll message them those details afterwards, because I think they're very key. So final two questions. So this one's from Simon. The government has encouraged British people to go and help at the farms. How would we go about getting work through the farms, and who would we ask?
Now, there is a website, the name of which I don't know off the top of my head. I read yesterday, I think it had crashed at one point because they'd had so many people who were looking at it. I'm not being rude, I'm just trying to see if I can find it while we're on the call. Let's have a look.
Pickforbritain.org.uk.
That's it. There you are. Well done, Paul. Pick for Britain. Now, that I think is particularly for fruit picking jobs, because the Guardian reported yesterday, farms still need up to 40,000 UK workers to harvest fruit and veg. Now, fruit obviously is particularly time sensitive because as it comes into bud, you need to pick it and get it off as quickly as possible. So I think that's why Pick for Britain has been set up. Individual farmers will be advertising locally, depending on where people are. But I think the Pick for Britain was established to provide a portal to funnel those through to farmers who will be very keen to get people. It's hard and it's difficult work and backbreaking work. And that's why over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, fewer people from the UK have wanted to go and do that. And that's why people have come from other countries to undertake it. But the crop is there, it waits for no one. And if you fancy some seasonal fruit and veg picking, then go to the website, and I hope it won't crash when you get on.
So the final question, will there be guidance regarding general public wearing of personal protective equipment, in particular masks? There is a huge amount of conflicting information being circulated. The masks that are readily available, according to scientific opinion, are pretty much useless. Do you think it could lull people into a false sense of security? That question came from Sharon.
Right. Well, thanks for that question, Sharon. Now, I'm not a scientist and I'm not a doctor, but I will tell you what I think on the basis of what I have read during the course of the last 2.5 months. Now, there are a different kind of masks, really three broad types. There are the FFP3s and N95s, I think they're called, which have filters on them that provide the highest degree of protection. There are then the scrubs masks that you will often see in hospitals. And then there are face coverings, which could include a handkerchief or a scarf. Now, the scientists say, well, they have conflicting views. I was on a call yesterday where I raised this point with the two scientists, and he said, I was talking to a colleague the other day, and she said she was pulling her hair out. Coronavirus is a disease that when you sneeze, comes out of your nose. you should cover it. In other words, she was quite clear that people should be wearing masks. Now, the government advice thus far has been in confined spaces like shops and on public transport. You should wear a face covering. They've been very anxious not to say a face mask because, again, to be honest, I think part of the reason for the unwillingness to advise on the wearing of masks is because there's been a shortage of PPE, and the government is worried that if it says everyone should wear a face mask as opposed to a face covering, then people will buy up all the stocks and there won't be any for staff in care homes or hospitals. Now, the conclusion one should draw from that is we need a huge effort to increase the production of masks because there's going to be big demand for them for months to come. In France, for example, the government hands them out so that people can put them on when they go on public transport. In some other European countries, it is compulsory to wear a mask if you're going to go on public transport. So ultimately, it's a choice for an individual, but the evidence appears fairly strong that if you wear a face covering or indeed a mask and you have coronavirus, it will reduce the likelihood that it will pass it on to someone else. The evidence is slightly less clear about whether it protects you, although doctors and nurses are wearing them all the time because they want to be protected, given the patients that they're dealing with. But they will have masks and goggles and plastic visors. Yeah, so that's what I think, what I've read in terms of the advice. And as one is out about, you see people wearing a wide variety of masks, lulling into a false sense of security. There isn't one way of trying to protect yourself: keeping distance, wearing a face covering or a mask, washing your hands, washing your hands, washing your hands. I know it seems rather simple, but when you look at how the virus can be on surfaces and a good thorough hand wash on a very regular basis absolutely has an impact on reducing the chance that if you have touched a surface that was touched by someone who was infected, you won't pass it on to yourself. I think the thing I find most difficult is not touching your face, because when we think about it, we touch up. I've scratched my ear at least once, I think, during the course of this Facebook live broadcast, which will be recorded for posterity, Paul. That's the hardest thing, all right? But thank you. If that is the last
yes
question, can I just once again say thank you very much to all of you for giving up the time to join us today. It's a great pleasure to have met you virtually and to take your questions and do my best to answer them. I don't know all the answers any more than anybody else, but we should share the information and understanding that we've got and support one another through what is, let's be frank, a very, very difficult time. And it is by supporting one another that we're going to come through this. Thanks. And thank you to Paul for organising it.
No, and thank you to joining, Hilary. So thank you for everybody that's listened. I'd really love to see your comments about how you think it went. I am planning to do more of these with some more of the people that have an impact on your local community and life over the coming weeks and months. And again, just a massive thank you for Hilary. I know you're an incredibly busy person. What I would say is anyone whose questions haven't been answered because they've been typing them as we've been wrapping up, we will get you a response, so they won't be ignored. It's just that we have a limited amount of Hilary's precious time. So thank you very much. Keep well, keep safe, and see you about the community when we're allowed to do so at some point. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.